And I'm especially delighted to be introducing our speaker for tonight, Dr. Anna Metaxas. So Anna is the Killam Professor at Dalhousie University. She is an expert in marine seafloor ecology and ecological connectivity of shallow and deep sea ecosystems. She received her bachelor's degree from McGill University, her master's from the University of British Columbia, and her PhD from Dalhousie University, where she is now based. Now, obviously, Anna has an amazing scientific career, but what's almost even more extraordinary is she is the kind of person who is doing that really critical work that all of us really rely on, bringing that science to public policy and contributing to some of the really big efforts to understand connectivity among different factors and making those understandings available for policymakers to actually use. And there's an extremely long list of publications and reports that she has contributed to or led. I will draw from just a very short list of these right now. So she co-leads the Biodiversity Conservation Task Force of the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, and she was the lead author of the Nexus Assessment of IPBES. And what's really interesting about that is this is an assessment, the Nexus Assessment. It's something that brings together all the different factors that are actually highly interlinked. So thinking not just about biodiversity loss, but looking at biodiversity loss and its relationships to water availability and quality, food insecurity, health risks, and climate change. So really having that holistic understanding of how all these factors are related to each other. She's advised processes by the International Seabed Authority and the Convention on Biological Diversity. So she has an absolutely massive amount of experience advising the Canadian government on the design and monitoring of marine protected areas. And we'll be hearing, of course, in her talk today about all this in terms of looking at connecting the dots to protect the ocean. And this is, of course, something that's really, I think, fundamental to the strategy of the Linnean Society. Hopefully all of you know, or for those of you who don't know as much about the society, we are really a broad tent of people interested in the natural world, not just from the perspective of science, but also looking at policy, looking at history, looking at art, looking at all the different ways that people interact with the natural world, and really working to make sure, for the benefit of a world where nature is understood, valued, and protected. And so if those are things that you are also interested in and you haven't already joined the Linnean Society, please do take a look at our society. And we'll talk a bit more about that in upcoming events at the end of this talk. But for now, let me hand over to our speaker for tonight, Dr. Anna Metaxas.
Can you see it now?
No, but still, oh, there we go, yeah.
Okay. So I will start with a land acknowledgement. I live and work in Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. This territory, as you can see, is surrounded by ocean, which has been a continuing inspiration for my work. So it's lovely to be living and working so close to the ocean. Now, speaking of the ocean, I know that maybe some of you are terrestrial people, land people, and don't often think about the ocean, but here's some statistics. The ocean, you all probably know that, covers 71% of a planet's surface. But also the ocean encompasses more than 95% of the planet's habitat volume. So it's not, the ocean is three-dimensional, and these full three dimensions are actually occupied by different species that perform different jobs and that offer different ecosystem services to us. Now, the reason I like this slide is because what you see here is different oceans, different ocean basins, but all you see is blue. And so we tend to think of our planet as our different continents, depending on where you look at it from. But really, our planet, as we all know, is a blue planet. The other thing, the reason I like this slide is because you can see that it's an unimpeded ecosystem. The ocean, there is no boundaries to the ocean, whereas we know that in order to go from one land to the next, you have to maybe take a ship or take an airplane. When you're traveling along the ocean, you can connect all the oceans without ever hitting land. And so there's an inherent connectivity in this particular part of our planet. Ooh, yes. So a lot of you, again, maybe for coming from the land perspective, and we often do not think who lives in the ocean. So I thought I would start with just giving you a little bit of a quick overview of who's there. So here on On this slide here, what we see is, of course, the primary producers. These are streams of phytoplankton that live at the surface of the ocean. They're primary producers that do a lot of the primary production, but also removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The reason you see it as this strings is because, of course, those blooms are being transported by currents. And in a way, what you're seeing there is a picture of what the currents are like at that ocean surface. Below that, what you see is a picture of phosphorescent phytoplankton that, again, has been carried by ocean currents to the beach. And many of us that travel to tropical locations, we often see these blooms in the middle of the night, which are spectacular. A wide diversity of zooplankton that you see here in this picture in the top right panel inhabits these surface waters. It's to sort of 200 meters of depth and consumes a lot of that phytoplankton. And in turn, we know that a lot of fish aggregate in the surface of the ocean to feed on this zooplankton. So this here is what we're talking about, is really the top 200 meters where light penetrates, where photosynthesis can occur. At the same locations at the surface, there's big animals that live there. Some of them are birds like the albatross that actually never touch land except very briefly to nest and reproduce, but then they spend the rest of their lives in the ocean. In the top right there, you see a shark. That shark is at a place called the Shark's Cafe, which is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, where sharks swim to and aggregate at certain periods of time. We don't know why they do that, but they just hang out. For some reason, they all go and hang out there. And of course, we know about mammals and other fish that use the oceans to navigate long migrations from feeding grounds to mating grounds and all the way back. Now, again, that's the surface, and that's something that we're more or less familiar. What we're less familiar with, or a lot of us are less familiar with, is what happens in those middle, 200 to 6,000 meters depth, which is a large volume. That's, almost 90% of the planet's volume. And so here we have a lot of spectacular animals, most of them undescribed, like the jellies that you see here on the right. That's the spectacular completely translucent squid that you see on the top left, and this beautiful unidentified fish larva that you see on the bottom right, left of your screen. So those are animals that live in the middle. And so what these sort of animals contribute to is what is one of the greatest migrations. It is the greatest migration on our planet. And so those animals, you can see they're translucent. They don't want to be eaten. And so in order to avoid that, they spend their most of the daytime, light time at depth, sometimes thousands of meters depth. And at night, they come up to the surface to feed and avoid being eaten. And so what you see here is a conglomerate of species that move in what is called the twilight zone and vertically migrate to feed and avoid being fed. So this is the largest volume of carbon and biomass, animal biomass, that actually migrates daily across thousands of kilometers. And all this happens in the middle of the ocean that we not often think about. Now, that's the middle of the ocean, but then, of course, there are ecosystems that are attached to the seabed that are the ones that I'm most familiar and work with and feel happiest around. And so these are the ones that I'm sure you're all familiar with. They're coastal kelp ecosystems, so seaweeds, coral reefs, seagrass beds, and of course, mangroves. But where I want to take you to is also a little bit deeper, and these are ecosystems that perhaps you're less familiar with. These are ecosystems that can be found anywhere from in the deep sea, from 200 meters, again, all the way down to thousands of meters depth. And so what you see here on the top left are beds of this unique sponge. Some of those sponges tend to be carnivorous. On the right, you see this beautiful forest of deep water corals. Again, here, what we see is actually a stony coral, a coral reef made out of stony coral that, again, is found at thousands of meters depth, hydrothermal vents, underwater volcanoes, and of course, cold seeps, which are where a lot of our oil production comes from. That's where we drill for oil, in cold seeps and methane seeps. So, of course, what happens is those ecosystems, the sort of water column and the seabed are connected, right? They're not separated. They're not acting independently. And one important link between those is carbon transfer. And a lot of the carbon transfer, we always thought that carbon is transferred from the surface when phytoplankton sink to the deep sea, when the blooms die. But now we're becoming quite aware of the fact that a lot of the carbon is getting transferred by bony animals as they migrate on that vertical migration that I mentioned, and in other ways. So for example, in the middle here, you see what is called the whale pump. That pump of carbon was discovered recently, just a few years back, and it basically entails that transfer of carbon by whales that feed at depth on, for example, on a squid, and then come to the surface, they poop out the nutrients, and those nutrients may feed phytoplankton blooms. So again, this is a migration of carbon over thousands of meters. On the other side here, what you see is what is called deadfall carbon. So all animals that migrate across the world's oceans at some point will die, even from old age. They sink to the seabed, again, thousands of meters, where they form unique ecosystems by animals that are adapted to feeding on those organisms. So some of that carbon will be consumed, and some of that carbon will be sequestered into the sediment. And so, speaking of all these connections, then brings me to what I would like to talk about today, which is about ecological connectivity. So I would like to, I apologize to those of you who may be experts for ecological connectivity, sorry, but I would like to give an introduction for those of you that are not. So overall, ecological connectivity describes ecological linkages between locations and habitats. And those ecological linkages may include individual organisms like animals migrating, or they can be linkages of the resources that animals require, for example, the carbon or nutrients that I mentioned. But when we're really talking about connectivity, what we're talking about is about flows and about movement. And I think that's very well illustrated in the picture that you see above, that actually is a schematic of flows from the Caribbean Sea, Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean Sea, and into the North Atlantic. So there's many types of connectivity, and those of us that work on connectivity struggle to be able to explain all those different connectivities, particularly to people that don't work on connectivity, particularly to managers and decision makers. So population connectivity is one of the types, and it's the one that I work on. And so population connectivity can be occurring within the life history or the one generation of a population. And so, for example, that involves adult movement or migration. So the fish go from one place to another to feed mate or whatever the task is. Larval dispersal of animals that actually do have a larval stage, that is also part of population connectivity. And for those of you who are geneticists, it also includes gene flow. Gene flow happening now intragenerationally, or expressing itself intergenerationally rather than within the generation of an individual moving from one place to another. Then we have ecosystem connectivity, and that is broader, right? That happens at the level of the ecosystem rather than individual species. And here we can think of multiple species that are moving among distinct communities. And the example on the slide there is of course from the tropics, because a lot of our slides come from the tropics. But what you see there is the egg to larval stage transitioning from, for example, from a coral reef in the case of the bumphead parrotfish, to inland to seagrass beds where little fish juveniles grow, and then those juveniles again migrate back out to the reef to spend their lives in the reef. So then you can have multiple species that are moving back and forth, and you can have species that are related, so predators following prey that are actually moving at the same time, which makes it an ecosystem connectivity. Now, you can also have movement of chemicals, energy, or materials, right? It's not just species. When you're thinking about ecosystem connectivity, there's actually other currencies. So in this schematic here, what happens is a bear will eat a fish. So it will take, let's say, protein from that fish. And when that bear pees in the woods, that protein then is excreted and transferred, becomes nutrients for the forest. And so here's a material, a nutrient that gets transported across different ecosystems simply by these trophic relationships. So that's all great. So overall, why is ecosystem connectivity important, ecological connectivity important? Well, it has several functions, as I just mentioned. It ensures replenishment of populations through larval dispersal. It can maintain genetic diversity through gene flow. It links different habitats to different life histories and by migration pathways. It maintains those trophic linkages. And as a consequence, because it does all those things, it promotes resilience to disturbances and facilitates recovery from such disturbances. So it's important that, you know, those connections are maintained if we want to be able to sustain the properties of the ecosystems that if we want to keep them healthy. Okay, so what happens if connectivity breaks down? Well, we're expecting a snowstorm tomorrow where I am and the east coast of Canada. And when snowstorms come in Canada, this is what our airports look like. Our airports shut down, flights are all canceled. So what does this mean? What you see here is the sort of travel routes of our major airline, Air Canada, which we all of us in Canada have learned to hate and love for different reasons. But if you see this and you started thinking about where, if a storm hits, where does it hit matters. So for example, if we go here to St. John's, which was hit by a storm last weekend, you know, as much as it matters to my friends at St. John's, if that airport closed, there's not going to be a catastrophic collapse of the the travel routes across Canada. However, if something had Toronto, if a storm happens in Toronto here in the middle of the country, you can see that a lot of connections are going through that city. And so what happens is the whole system collapses. So all those flights are canceled, and that perpetuates over time. And so what is important is not only understanding where those connections happen, but also how important the particular locations are if an ecosystem, if a network breaks down. So understanding connectivity, let's see now how much has this connectivity been incorporated in the global frameworks for conservation. So this is the first one where it appeared a long time ago. This is the Aichi targets that were proposed in, 2010, and they're for protecting biodiversity, and they were supposed to be implemented by 2020. So Aichi target 11 was talking about protected areas. And back then in 2010, what you see here is that those areas where the systems of protected areas were proposed to be well connected. So it did appear in the international frameworks as early as 2010, connectivity did. And then, you know, it sort of disappeared, but then all of us at the time and for the next few years, connectivity was kind of a mystical concept. People sort of kept mentioning it, but nobody. The actual sort of conservation practitioners and the managers had a hard time wrapping their brain around what exactly is this thing. But then all of a sudden, it became all the rage. So in 2020, at the IUCN actually put out guidelines for specifically conserving connectivity. So we have gone from ensuring that conservation areas are connected to actually deliberately protecting connectivity. Great, so it's really gaining a lot of importance. Fast forward to the Global Biodiversity Framework that was approved in 2022 in Montreal, December 2022. The framework has several goals and it has several targets. And I give you here some examples only of targets and goals that include the terms connectivity. So for goal A, connectivity is explicitly supposed to be maintained, enhanced, or restored by 2050. Target 2, this is the target about restoration. Again, you know, restoration is supposed to happen so that we enhance, among other things, ecological integrity and connectivity. Target 3, this is our 30 by 30, protect 30% by 2030. Again, here we go again with the systems of protected areas, and once again, expected to be well connected. So very much showing up in those international fora. But is it showing up? This is now a document that was prepared by UNWCMC, and it was advice that was provided. It was prepared by a group of experts that got together to assess how many indicators of connectivity do we have so that we can measure progress towards the GBF. And so this report was delivered to the Convention on Biological Diversity before the GBF was signed or approved. And so in that report, they evaluated a whole bunch of different indicators. And so this table here is from the report, and it summarizes the available indicators in the monitoring framework and the future needs. And so what you see down on this first column is the goals and the targets, and across you see the different indicators. And in blue, those are ones that are proposed or available, and in white, those that are not. And so I will focus your attention to those last two columns, which are talking about coastal and marine connectivity and about migratory connectivity, mainly in the ocean, and they're blank. So those columns suggest that those experts could not come up with any existing indicators for measuring ecological connectivity in coastal and marine environments. And that gave me pause, because I have been spending the last 25 years of my career studying exactly that. So I'm not sure why this blank existed, but it did. And so it made a few colleagues of mine and I get together and write a paper and try to address the issue. And one of the issues was that all the indicators that have been proposed were initially developed for a terrestrial realm. And the experts were mostly from the terrestrial realm. And this pointed us to a huge gap, which always happens as far as the marine scientists are concerned, which is a lot of the information, a lot of the expertise covers the land, but the sea is somehow missing, although it forms 71% of the surface and 95% of the volume of our planet. There are some differences. So there are some indicators that we could use, but there are some fundamental differences in the marine realm that, need us to consider ecological connectivity a little bit different. The main thing is that there's a third dimension that is very, very large, and the same organism will move in a range of directions, and wherever the flow is going. But those directions can span thousands of kilometers. So the same animal will be moving vertically, but also horizontally across large distances, and that's not so often seen in the terrestrial environment. Overall, it's a more open system. I show you the picture of the ocean. There's fewer boundaries. There are some, but there are fewer hard boundaries that, as you would encounter on land. And that means that the rates of import and export from particular locations or ecosystems may be greater than on land, and they're facilitated by the ocean. So the systems are generally more open, and there's less resistance, again, because we don't have those hard boundaries. So often, when we're thinking about connectivity in the ocean, we think about distance rather than, oh, I have to go across a highway, right? Because we don't have as many highways. One aspect that is not as different, but it's much more prevalent perhaps in the ocean, is that the dispersal ability varies among life history stages for a particular species. And that happens for a lot more species than it does on land. And so when we think about the ocean and about the types of connectivity and what makes it different in a schematic way, if we think about rivers and if we think about a lot of the connectivity of land, what we have is what is called directed connectivity, in that animals are perhaps moving more so in a particular direction. That may be constrained. If you're in a river, you can only flow down the river, up the river, swim up the river, or it can be a constraint, so you can have a lot more, points where you move across. But the difference in the ocean is what we mostly have what is called diffuse connectivity. So there, the dots can be the places where the nodes or the MPAs or the populations that are unconstrained. So they can be moving in different directions at different speeds with different strengths. And so because the ocean has this third dimension and because the currents are moving in all sorts of different directions. And so measuring diffuse connectivity is a lot harder because it varies in space and varies in time, and it's a little bit less predictable than directed connectivity. So because it's more prevalent in the ocean, it makes it a little different than developing using the same indicators as we do on land. Okay, so let's talk now more specifically about some of the work that we do with a general introduction, then I'll talk to you about what we have been doing. So of course, because of that lack of barriers, because ocean is an open system and it has less resistance, a lot of what we're talking in terms of ecological connectivity applies to patchy habitats. And you see, for example, here on the top, you can see all this brown, these are a kelp bed, but you can see that this kelp bed is not, throughout, homogeneously distributed throughout the coast. And if an animal lives in this kelp bed and only wants to live in kelp beds, it has to traverse to go to this other kelp bed. So it has to be able to disperse to there. And that's the case, of course, with reefs, patch reefs that you see in this part, in this picture here. And this shows seagrass meadows. And again, there's sort of some patchiness to their distribution. And that patchiness has to be overcome so that ecological connectivity is achieved. And this is schematic, is sort of shows a very coarse sketch of patches where each one of those brown splodges is a patch, and some of them are sources of connections. So they release propagules, animals, whatever the beginning of the connection is from there. And you can see, for example, here, from this patch, there's movement towards this one and on this one, but then there's no movement from this particular patch to anything else. So this is a sink, making this a source. And we can have one-dimensional, single direction transfers, or we can have bidirectional transfers. And so when we're thinking about those connections, it is important to, first of all, identify the connections, right? So we know things move from A to B, but not from B to A. That's important. But also what's important is to identify the importance of these connections. And we often forget about that when we think about connectivity. And so, for example, I've just circled some random arrows here. It could be that those connections are more important than all the other arrows in this particular setting. And so we need to identify what they are, because we need to assign perhaps more attention, bring more attention to those in terms of their protection. So the animals I work with, as John mentioned, I am a benthic ecologist. So I work with animals and plants that are attached to the seabed. And you see some examples here. I work with kelp, deep water corals, mussels. We've worked with all these different organisms. And what characterizes these organisms is what is called a complex life cycle. So basically, the adults are fixed. And if they're not fixed, they don't move very far. They may move meters, tens of meters, hundreds of meters in their lifetime, but they don't go very far. So what happens is these adults, as they're from the location where they are, they will release propagules in the water. And so larvae then develop in the water, and those disperse or retain, they reach a suitable habitat, and then they detect a cue on the seabed, they attach to the seabed, they go through metamorphosis, and then they recruit back to the adult population, and the cycle continues. So because the adults are sessile, larvae are the ones that provide the connections, because these are the ones that sort of spread far and wide, and they can spread hundreds of kilometers before they attach. And so here's a collage of different types of larvae, different benthic marine invertebrates, but these larvae are typically not very abundant. They're rare, and they're low concentrations. They're typically transparent. They're small, and they can't swim. So they're basically advected by currents. They go wherever the currents take them. And so what happens to larvae in the water? Well, that depends. And that becomes critical when we think about connectivity and how we're going to estimate it and how we're going to protect it. It depends on how long they spend in the water. And so in this schematic here, you see the red line that indicates the dispersal pathway of a larva that spends a short time. It's a short distance disperser. So the larva is released and spends some time meandering in the water, perhaps has some small ability to swim a little bit vertically when the currents are weaker. So vertical currents are much weaker than horizontal currents. And so it will move up and down a bit, maybe because of currents, maybe because it can. And then at some point, it will become competent. It drops to the seabed and it settles. Now we have this other larva in blue, which has spending a lot more time in the water. And so that larva may vertically migrate, as the zooplankton do. It may be carried away by currents, as you see here in the arrows. If it hits a food patch, it may stick around and try to feed there. And so after all that meandering, at some point, it will also reach competence and drop to the seabed and attach and metamorphose to an adult. But you can see that the distance that has been over which the blue one has been transported is much farther. And so this is something that we need to understand if we're gonna try to protect it. So here's an example of how this can affect, this consideration can affect where we put marine protected areas. This is a very crude schematic, but it is a schematic that was included in the Federal Advisory Committee for Marine Protected Areas in the United States in 2019. And what you see here is 3 panels. So the top panel, this brown blotches, are actually representing offshore reefs. And so what you see in the top panel is with these dashed lines are example pathways of long distance dispersing larvae. So you can see each of those arrows goes quite far. The one in the middle shows larvae that are intermediate distance dispersers, and you can see that most arrows don't go as far. And the bottom one shows short distance dispersers. And so the little red boxes are indicators of where would you put a marine protected area if you were to consider the distance of dispersal. And so you can see that there's not much difference between the top and the middle, but in the bottom one, you have a little bit of a difference in terms of where that MPA is placed. And so this one on the far right is placed a little bit over, like on the reef over from the one that it would be placed if you had intermediate, or you're trying to protect dispersal by an intermediate or a large distance disperser. And so understanding how far this larvae go will help you do your best in terms of trying to understand where you're protecting sources, sinks, and if you have self-recruitment or short distance dispersers, as you would for a kelp, for example, and I will get to that in a minute, or long distance dispersers. So I would like to first give you an example of some work that we have done to illustrate how to identify connections between different patches or MPAs and to I will focus on this in this area here. So what you see here again is this is Nova Scotia, it's the coast of Canada. And what you see in these colored schematics are proposed marine conservation areas, coastal conservation areas only. And the green ones are proposed and they're still to be determined, but the blue one here is actually an area of interest. So it's actually under consideration and has been since 2018 for our Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans to become a marine protected area. So this is where our work has been focused. And the reason it has focused there is because here's Nova Scotia again, here's what's located. This is a close-up of the region, Eastern Shore Islands. And one of the reasons that is considered for protection is because it has natural biodiversity, little impact for human activities. And one example is that it harbors these luxuriant kelpites. Okay. So I will talk about 2 species as an example, and these are the 2. The first one is the kelp. So the kelp is a seaweed. It's ecosystem engineer, well known to protect, to harbor, assemblages of different fish that may use it as nurseries, a different diverse, high diversity as ecosystem engineers do. What you see on the kelp is this white crust. And so this is an invasive bryozoan that was introduced in our region in early 1990s, or at least that's when we detected it. And so this is an annual colonial epiphytic bryozoan. And so what it does, it releases larvae sometime in the summer, and then those larvae settle on the blade and start growing asexually. So they form these colonies, and eventually they cover the blades. Now, what they do as well as by covering the blades is they compromise the structural integrity of the blades. And as fall comes and increased storms happening, hurricanes may come through, they make the probability of the kelp getting dislodged or the blades broken up more higher. And so the combination of increasing temperatures which favor the growth of this invasive and don't favor the growth of kelp have actually led to a near complete defoliation of most of our kelpites along Nova Scotia. So when we're thinking about protection, as I said, the kelp beds on the Eastern Shore Islands are actually, some of them are actually quite healthy. So if we're thinking about protection, here's a situation where we need to think about good connectivity. So making sure that the kelp beds have connected, they get enough propagules to self-sustain. But we also need to think about bad connectivity. And that is what happens to the invasive bryozoan that actually harms the kelp. And so we try to compare dispersal potential between the two and try to get to some of these answers. So the propagule characteristics of those two, they're very different. So kelp release spores. They release spores throughout the year, but most of the spores are released in late autumn. In late autumn, there's a lot of spores that are being released. And at that time, and the spores usually spend no more than 2 days suspended, right? They almost immediately drop next to the kelp. Now, the bryozoan larvae are starting to get spawned sometime in the summer, but then as the population grows, they get spawned more and more. And those larvae spend a lot of time in the water, up to a month. And so now if we think back to that figure of the red and the blue lines, we can see a problem developing. So the approach one of the approaches that we use to try to understand dispersal of those two different species is dispersal modeling. And so this is the more sophisticated approach that can be used for this sort of demographic connectivity. And I will get back to this issue later in my talk. But I present here the most sophisticated approach. So here what we do is we use a ocean circulation model that models circulation. It breaks up our matrix of the entire domain that you see here in individual cells. And then we have measurement, projections of velocity within those cells. And then what we do is we seed particles, which represent spores or larvae, into each of those cells, and then track them for a period of time, and then look at where they went. And the output is a probability density distribution, which I will show you next. So this is the approach. So let's look at kelp first. Again, this is the output for kelp. So here we have the outline of the area of interest. And the kelp spores were released from all these different black dots that you see. And so what we see here is, for the most part, those spores remain within the area of interest, and some of them spill over, but there's a pretty good probability that the kelp beds will get enough self-recruitment, enough self-retention of spores that actually can grow the kelps back or support the ecosystems. And there's not a lot of spillover, or at least it's not very far. So if we think about the individual MPA, be great for kelp. Okay, so let's look at the bryozoan now. So again, here's our MPA, or proposed MPA. Here's where the bryozoan was released. A lot of bryozoans, as you see with the yellow color, a lot of those remain within the kelp bed. But then you can see that a lot of it, this cloud of points, extends all the way down to the southwest corner of Nova Scotia. And so there is significant considerations, because we're protecting this area, but we're also protecting the invasive species. And if I can bring you back to this map, you can see that all of a sudden, all these places here that may be protected because they have kelp beds, because you're trying to protect the kelp beds, regardless of how much production of the invasive is within them, there's also larvae that are coming from afar, and they're supplementing those populations. So when we're thinking about how to plan conservation, we need to think both about good connectivity, but we also need to think about bad connectivity. And often we don't do that. We only think about the good stuff. Okay, so that's identifying. All we've done is we say they will go from A to B. So how do we try to understand the importance? So I will give you an example now from some deep sea work of trying to understand the importance of the different connections rather than just the direction. So for this, we need to do a network analysis. So I'll show you is an example of how we do this. Is a simplified example. And so here what you see in A, B, C, and D are example nodes. Think about them as nodes, think about them as populations, think about them as MPAs. They are dots. And then with the data that I just presented to you, the kinds of data that we presented, we can sort of estimate those errors, right? So how much goes from A to B? How much goes from A to A? How many larvae go from B to D, and so on. And then we can generate, based on the proportion of propagules that are moving from A to B or C and also or getting retained, we can assign heaviness to those arrows, that the heavier the arrow is, the more, the higher the importance. And so what we do is we build this matrix, this connectivity matrix, where it has origin as rows and destinations as columns. And so, for example, here we can see that one larva will go from A to B, two larvae will stay within B, and so on. So we build that connectivity matrix. And from that matrix, then, we can calculate metrics that tell us something about the importance of nodes. And so it can be different ones, like how much proportion of larvae are recruiting that were produced locally, how many are retained, etc. And importantly, we can produce these things called centrality metrics, which is what an example is that I will use. So the organism that I will use for this one is deep water corals. And so this is a deep water coral, Desmophila pertussum, it is called. It lives in depths up to, 1,000, 2,000 meters. And it's a stony coral, so it forms reefs in some places or dense aggregations. It has the same type of reproduction as the other vertebrates that I talked about. It has a larva that is released in the water, and it can spend, because it's deep sea and the water is colder, it can spend anywhere from a month to 2 months moved around by currents. And so this is the domain of our study. Here's Canada, United States. And so what you see on the dots here, these are observations that we have along the continental margin of existing populations of Desmophilum pertussum. And here you see the two currents that are the dominant currents in the region, the Gulf Stream, which you're all familiar with because it all comes to you from us, and the Labrador current, which is the cold water current that comes from the north and sort of runs along the continental margin in a southwesterly direction. So what we did is, or what my student Graham Guy did for this, is to try to do the analysis that I talked about and look at each one of those populations and see how important they are as nodes in the network. And so there's two metrics here. Purple symbols are showing betweenness centrality. This is a metric of whether a site, a node, the population is a stepping stone or can act as a stepping stone and facilitate dispersal. And you see there's one here in the Gulf of Mexico that facilitates dispersal from the Gulf of Mexico out. There's another one here in the Straits of Florida, which also facilitates dispersal out from that Caribbean into the North Atlantic. And so the larger the symbol, the stronger the impact, the higher the importance in the network. And then there's this other one called PageRank. And here, what this does is it illustrates or calculates the nodes that are of the highest importance, so that if that node is removed from the system, the network will probably collapse. The reason this node is here is because that's where the currents from the south and the north meet. That's why we think it's there. But think of it as the Toronto of the Desmophilum pertussum in the North Atlantic. If this node goes, the network is going to be in deep trouble. And so this is a way that you can calculate, importance of different locations, different MPAs to a population, and think about where you place your protection efforts. Now, please note this says present day, and of course, there's a plethora of articles out there right now that are coming out that are underscoring the importance of climate in sort of maintaining, or the impact of climate on connectivity in MPAs or not. And there are different ways that climate can impact connectivity. First of all, the most obvious one is habitat suitability. So if, for example, a particular area becomes too warm or too acidic, our stony coral is not going to survive there, so that node disappears simply because it's no longer suitable. There can also be impacts on traits. So larval dispersal depends on larval development. The faster a larva develop, which it will be faster if the water is warmer, the shorter the period of time will be in the water, and it will not get as far. So maybe it will not be able to reach the node that it would have reached otherwise if the water remained colder. And of course, that is also impacted by changes in currents and corridors that also are anticipated by climate change. So we actually have done some of the work, and so our results show that actually, if you lose 20% of your habitat because of climate, you lose that connection that is really important. That important node in the network that I just showed you disappears. Okay, so there are several ecological criteria that are used for the design of marine protected areas. And as I try to sort of explain to you, connectivity is always being mentioned as one of the criteria, particularly for networks of MPAs. So my PhD student, Ariana Balber, did a review of the literature of management plans to try to see how many MPAs actually use different criteria, which criteria different MPAs used. So she looked at management plans from countries with systematic conservation planning, which you see listed there, and sort of extracted the criteria that were used. There were about 700 and change MPAs that were looked at, and there were about 7 MPA networks. And so you can see the top criterion is representation. This is how we decide where we're going to put networks or MPAs, and connectivity is second from the bottom. So this review was published in 2019, but I can tell you that those numbers have not significantly changed since then, even though more marine protected areas are coming into effect or are being planned anyway. So what is it? Why is this problem? And so one of the reasons is getting back to that diffuse connectivity. We think it's the way we measure connectivity in the ocean. So the tools that are available are not always available. And so I talked about the sort of the biophysical modeling, and that is the most sophisticated tool. It requires knowledge of currents, it requires expertise in modeling, and it includes it requires a lot of computing facilities, etc., capacity. So not necessarily available to all. But there's simpler ways of measuring connectivity or estimating connectivity. This is the simplest. Here's your place where you want to estimate connectivity from. You know what the average current speed is. Let's say, on average, currents move at 10 meters per second. You do a calculation. You know what the planktonic duration is of your animal. You multiply the two, you get a distance. So you go from your start to the end of that distance, and that is how far your larvae are going to get. This is very crude. This is the one that was applied, for example, in the protected areas in the California system. Simple. Now, there's one approach that we tried that is a little bit more complicated, although not particularly so. And this is putting a current meter down. All this does is it sort of refines a little bit your estimate of that current speed. And so what the current meter will give you is it will give you sort of over a long period of time integrating velocities in different directions. And so in the instance of our system here, what we found was that there's a lot more current running, along the coast of Nova Scotia than there is across. So rather having a big circle for the dispersal distance, you actually create an ellipse to account for that difference, right? And so this is not, all it requires is a current meter, which is not that unattainable. And so then what we did is we tried to see what are the difference in predicting dispersal area using all those different methods. And so here you see what you see is, again, the cloud. This is for the bryozoan again, as an example. This is the cloud of larvae that I showed you before. In pink, you see all the different conservation areas. In orange, you see the dispersal area predicted by using the crude estimate of multiplying distance by speed or time by speed. And in blue, you see the estimate here based on simply putting the current meter. And what we can see here is that I mean, the orange is terrible, but the blue is not. It's not that bad. And so especially considering about whether larvae are going to reach marine protected areas, I mean, it covers most of them. So it's a good compromise. It's not as expensive. It may be doable. So what we think is that we need a lot more studies like this, because this is particular for our case, that involve comparison of those tools, trying to make the information a little bit more accessible. So the one issue is the tool, the other issue is the target. So the problem with connectivity is, like, we don't know how much is enough, right? So when we're thinking about spatial targets, we know 30%, we know what that is, right? 30%. You can estimate 30% of a particular ecosystem. But enhancing connectivity doesn't really have a good way to target it, to make a target for. And so what we did in this opinion piece is we tried to come up with a process of going from these high-level goals that are kind of vague and sort of breaking them down to try to make it a little bit more tractable. And this will be particularly important for decision makers, practitioners on the ground that have to take that goal and turn it into something. And so, for example, here I can walk you through persistent and recovery will be the high-level goal. And then you're thinking about, okay, how can we do this? Well, you maybe want to have a network where you protect sites that are linked by dispersal, right? We know that's how you protect connectivity. And then that's an actionable goal. Then you can go into an objective and think about, okay, well, maybe what I'm trying to do is maximize incoming number of propagules. And so then using your connectivity matrix, then you can again define it a little bit more. And then go down to the sort of protect or restore your network to ensure that you maximize the incoming seeds. So it is not intuitive. And so that causes a problem. And one way that we have proposed where this sort of barrier can be overcome is by better communication between the managers, the practitioners on the ground, and scientists. So here's a flow chart, a framework. And so the way this starts is basically managers have to say, these are my conservation objectives. It may be, enhancing connectivity. And then they sit down together with scientists to understand which, because it may not be all of them, which of the conservation objectives are actually require the consideration of connectivity. Once they decide what those are, the scientists go away, they measure it, and then they take whatever those measurements are, then translate it to something that is useful for the practitioners. And then the practitioners consider it, whether they need to include that particular aspect of connectivity, the design, and then they set up their design, and then they sort of, to check it, they explain how they implemented it, and then the scientists go back, they say if this is going to work or it's not going to work. And so if it does, great. If it doesn't, start again. But it's this cycle, this conversation that happens between the practitioners and the scientists that is essential in trying to break down the barriers to incorporating connectivity. So in closing, here are some thoughts that perhaps we can discuss. And first of all, I think, the one important aspect about the ocean is that it has inherently high connectivity. But that is sort of also a problem because it has a lot of this diffuse connectivity, which is harder to measure. We know that the importance of ecological connectivity and conservation is well recognized, but we have this problem of this gap of implementation of ecological connectivity in the marine realm specifically. And although we have tools to assess it, implementing targets can be really hard. And so the proposal is that we need much stronger and deliberate communication between science and decision-making to overcome this problem and this gap. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions. I think I'll stop sharing, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. That was really fantastic. I mean, you covered a huge amount of science and policy in that. We have some questions in the chat, and so I'll start with those, since I often have the habit of diving in with my own questions before we get to anything else. And to anybody who is, to all of you online, please do add in your questions to the chat, and I will to the Q&A section, and I will ask them. So the first question that popped up quite early on in your talk was from Andrew James Lewis, who asks, what remedies are available when ecosystem networks are disconnected by climate change? For example, warming and cooling ocean currents like North Atlantic Rift.
remedies. Wow. Stop driving cars.
Yeah.
Reduce emissions. I mean, right. All joking aside, I think that is the major remedy. But in terms of specifically about connectivity, there's different ways that we're thinking about now in terms of what is called future-proofing connectivity. And there's different suggestions. So one is, you sort of have some sites that sort of you project where the changes may happen in environmental conditions, and although they're not protected now, you wouldn't think of protecting them now. You are, protecting them for future, because that's going to be where things are going to end up. There is, so there's sort of other ideas of ensuring that you have stepping stones so that transitioning, so as distributions are changing or shifting, animals have intermediate stepping stones so they can go from where they are now to where they need to be without, running out of energy as they're migrating. And, then there's other, some scientists suggest that we protect extremes of the range. So we both protect the shift in the southern, at least in, the near the equator areas, as well as, where the animals are shifting to, so that you protect a suite of adaptations so that you have a better chance of adapting. So there's different ways that we're thinking about it. Yeah.
Right. Essentially hedging your bets in terms of
exactly. Yeah.
Right. And can I just follow up with how likely is it that we will be able to accurately predict the scale or the speed of those shifts in time to actually put in place some of those mitigations?
So, yeah, that's a big issue, right? And so it takes a long time to establish one. So years to a decade to put one in place. And so to anticipate what will be happening in a decade, let alone in 20 or 30 years, it's going to be difficult, because we know that the norms, whatever the projections are now, they're not working, right? Change is happening faster than we predicted. There are tipping points. And so I think one of the solutions, at least for now, is that the process is accelerated. So we actually don't have to wait for a decade, because by then things will have changed and we're like working 10 years behind. But if we accelerate the process by which we implement networks, MPAs, then at least we can sort of keep up with the change and keep up the modeling with the change. But yeah, at the speed that we're doing it now, it's very difficult.
Right. Okay. So it's really about finding the most efficient ways to put these mitigations in place so that we can at least, to the level that we can predict, get them in place, and also be flexible as things change as our predictions.
That's right. And being flexible is difficult because, of course, putting MPAs is not all about conservation. It's also about resource use, right? And politics, but also resource use. So it's difficult to tell somebody who fishes in a place that at the moment is not at risk to stop fishing, because, it may be at risk in 30 years, but we're not sure. It's tricky. It's tricky. Yeah.
Absolutely. Here's another one. So thanks for a really interesting talk. How could kelp and coral restoration be designed in order to contribute to stable carbon storage in the ocean? And how could the carbon storage effect be correctly measured?
Oh, wow. This is like stuff of people's research programs. Okay. So restorations, there was a question about restoration, right? Involve restoration.
Yeah, in carbon storage and restoration, basically, how can you
yeah, so these are two different topics. The first one is about restoration, and I think we need to be very careful about restoration, because we saw what happened in Florida or in the Gulf of Mexico, for example. Millions were invested in restoring corals, then another heat wave came, gone. And so I think while restoration can be useful in certain situations, it's not very helpful if the stressor is not removed. So if the stressor is ocean warming, restoration is not going to work, because sooner or later it's going to warm again. If the stressor is some pollution or sediment loading and we can remove the stressor, then restoration can work. So that's one part, right? So even if it doesn't work, in terms of sequestration, there's different ecosystems that we know, like seagrass beds restore carbon, sequester carbon, mangroves sequester carbon. Some deep sea ecosystems we think sequester carbon, although we're not very certain. But those numbers have very large errors associated. So we're still trying to get at how much carbon is actually getting sequestered, because sequester means remove for at least 100 years, minimally, right? That's what the International Panel on Climate Change has said, at least 100 years. And so, there's some, we know carbon is being sequestered in sediments, in deep sea sediments, and those can be measured and they are being measured by paleo oceanographers. But in terms of the actual, coastal ecosystem, it's a lot harder because we also don't have the true extent. So if we're trying so we can get an estimate of a small area, but then multiplying it by, the entire coast of Canada becomes really problematic because we don't have good data that extends the entire coast. So there's a lot of error in that estimate. So, yeah.
Is there the same situation as I think people are increasingly talking about in land, where the goals of recovery and the goals of net zero might actually be, not aligned, right? You would do different things if your goal is carbon storage than you would do if nature recovery is your goal. In terms of the kinds of things you would plan.
Yeah, I think there may be more aligned, because all those ecosystems, like if you're trying to, it will take their protection, the conservation or restoration or whatever your choice is, to also ensure carbon sequestration. So I think they'll be more aligned, because if you're trying to protect the ecosystem, you're protecting biodiversity, you're enhancing all those different things, and you're also, increasing carbon sequestration. So there may be more aligned. So maybe easier, less contentious.
Easier is always good. So that's great.
Yeah.
Let me go back to the questions online. Okay, so isn't it resilience or survivability that is critical to map to define MPAs, with connectivity helping define how these are defined?
Yes.
Connectivity provides resilience, but surely it's also a principal cause of biodiversity loss, which is characterized by everywhere being like everywhere else. Okay, I see what they're getting at there.
Sorry, can you repeat everything after resilience?
Sure. So connectivity provides resilience, but surely is also a principal cause of biodiversity loss, because I think the idea here is that homogenizes different systems.
Yeah. Right. So two things. I agree fundamentally that here we're not, so there's two different things, right? One is protecting connectivity or ensuring resilience by maintaining connectivity. And that's sort of what the first target, the well-connected ecosystems get at, right? It's sort of, and though in those situations, I agree, yes, it's all about resilience. It's all about, what we're trying to do is do what we can to make sure that that ecosystem is resilient to change or can recover from change. And then there is the aspect of protecting connectivity for its own sake. And so if we think about, for example, migratory species like whales, you have to make sure that they don't get hit by ships. So you want to, provide corridors that they can move through. And that is actually a specific connectivity directed conservation action. Now, homogenizing is not going to happen necessarily, because you also need suitable habitat, right? So if a coral needs certain, every species has a particular, requirements, particular temperatures, salt content, acidity, whatever. And so that's not everywhere. And that is why we don't have reefs everywhere, of seagrass everywhere, or kelp beds, right? So for those species that have specific requirements, I'm not concerned about homogenization. But what I do think is important is this bad connectivity. So when we talk about invasive species, yeah, right. that connectivity, and that's the point I was trying to make. But then all of a sudden you have the stressor that you're just facilitating it because you're promoting its connectivity and conserving. So in that case, you may homogenize that population that has, as an invasive species, perhaps less specific environmental requirements across a larger area.
Okay, great, thank you. Here's one that says, can we all loudly and confidently stand up for public transport and avoiding personal SUVs, switching off coal, oil, and gas taps pronto? I think that's in response to your earlier response to a question about really, how can we mitigate against climate change? Let's stop it from happening.
Yeah.
So I am certainly comfortable standing up for public transportation.
Yes.
Fast trains over fast cars, please.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, and a lot more. There's a lot more we can do, right? But I mean, that is the main thing that we need to do. That's it. Yeah.
And I think more importantly than standing up for these things, let's vote for the people who will implement public transportation and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. Because we can stand up and shout all we want, but if we're voting in people who don't support those, then we won't get anywhere.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, here's one from Julian. Are there resources available to those evaluating possible MPAs focusing on connectivity and protected areas that are already in place? For example, the NOAA have taken 50 years to formalize Atlantic salmon protection of spawning and fishing.
So there's resources specifically for connectivity?
Yeah.
So the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, has it has a particular connectivity working group. And so that side has resources. There are MPA network systems like in the United States, there has been that NOAA has I'm very careful because I know that I don't know how much of that is going to be there, but
has it been canceled yet, NOAA? Or is that
that's right. NOAA has a group that deals with North American marine protected area networks. And so they have a lot of, their side has a lot of resources. So there are the same, I know MedPan, which is also the Mediterranean Marine Protected Area Network, has resources. And some of those resources are broad and some of them are more specific to the particular region. Yeah.
Okay. Are there implications for connectivity in deep sea mining?
Oh boy, there we go. So yes, of course there are. And this has been, this implication. So the sort of I'll just focus on the area which is now more likely under consideration for mining to happen, sooner rather than later. And that is this massive area in the middle of the Pacific zone, Central Pacific. Is called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. It's the size of the United States of America. And there have been exploration contracts that have been given out. And now there's exploitation contracts that are supposed to be considered. Now, in that area, there was a study by scientists that got together and proposed a design of a network of protected areas, which are called something else, but let's call them protected areas for now. And those were actually used connectivity criteria. Now, because we didn't know what the connectivity is, they used those rules of thumb that I suggested, how far the areas would be. And so they had to be large enough to make sure that there's self-recruitment, or they have to be close enough so that there's dispersal from one to the other. And so there was this management plan. It was put forward. It was modified because of because the contracts already was in place, and so they all had to fit all the MPAs around it. So it should be considered, of course, because we have to make sure that whatever areas are put aside are resilient and they can self-sustain in light of mining, because whatever gets mined, it doesn't come back. That's gone. So definitely for that purpose. And there's another one there, which is connectivity, but of sediment that gets resuspended. So you may often have heard about the sediment plume, which is the plume that gets generated when these machines go through and then mix up with it. And so that plume is also particles that are passive that are moving, across the ocean. So there's connectivity there. And so there's a situation where we want to minimize. So we want to make sure, for example, that whatever protection we put in has a buffer so that particles are actually not hitting the protected area. So yes, very important.
Good, thanks. And I think we'll take this last question here, which is, what is your top tip for building kelp areas health?
Kelp areas health. Okay, assuming again, so I will return back to the issue of the stressor. So find a place where your stressor is no longer present, or catch the kelp before it disappears completely. So one of the approaches that we're thinking about now is enhancement as opposed to restoring. And so if we monitor kelp beds and we can sort of start seeing fluctuations because of those stressors, perhaps one way to enhance them is to sort of increase recruitment. And so plant plants or create habitats where spores can settle and survive. And so it's more sort of watching it before it reaches a stage where it has completely declined, because it is unclear where kelp beds that have transitioned to another state, we'll be able to get them back. Yeah.
I guess I will invoke chair's privilege and just ask one final closing question. And in that one of the last plots you showed, you looked at the priorities for designating MPAs, and connectivity was very low on the list. But of course, that list was very biased towards Western, largely northern countries. Do you feel like is there any evidence that those priorities are different in the global South?
Yeah, so we also did look at some. So for example, Chile is now having, is one of the countries that's developing a pretty, I don't want to say robust, because I don't think any of them are, but it is developing a network of marine protected areas that is considering a lot more these issues, including connectivity. The South Africa has implemented a major network of marine protected areas, and so they put it in place. And so there's a way to do it backwards, right? And so that's the way, not backwards, but
in reverse,
post establishment, right? And so so they have established, they have a network, and now they're working with connectivity experts to try to say, okay, how is connectivity working? Is it working? Do we need to add something? Do we need to make something bigger? And so they did the work that they had to quickly, well, it wasn't quickly, it took a decade, but while they could, and now they're refining based on connectivity. But, network, Canada doesn't have a well-established network of marine protected areas. The United States has very few, so they're very sporadic. So I would say global South or global North, the issue of how to build a network that it's not just a collection of marine protected areas without thinking about representativity or connectivity is just starting to be thought about. And that is because it's hard. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, well, thank you very much. That was an absolutely fascinating talk, and thank you for the the fantastic and important work that you do scientifically and on the policy level, because it is really critical, and certainly all of us really appreciate it. It's been a huge pleasure to hear you talk about this work, and I'm sure many of us are inspired to learn more and to think more about connectivity and those hard to measure things. So just before I close, I just want to remind all of you that we have a really full slate of events coming up. For those of you in London, we have a number of workshops in the Linnean Society at Burlington House. The next talk that we have is on February 20th on the natural trade, naturalists and the slave trade. Then we have a live online demo about conserving 18th and 19th century paper. And on March 5th, we have the hidden histories of women in botany. So do go onto our website if you'd like to see more details about all those events. And I look forward to seeing all of you or many of you at some of those in the future. And so let me just close by once again thanking Anna for a really fascinating evening. Thank you so much. And happy Darwin's birthday.
Thank you.